Hey, what's going on everyone? It's Deggy again, back with another Disney Lorcana video. We're just going to go ahead and dive right in. As you can tell, this video is about some deck building tips and tricks. Just some helpful suggestions, I suppose, for making a Disney Lorcana deck. I had mentioned this before several times in my other videos, but I used to play the game called Duel Masters, the trading card game, way back in the day. And the reason I bring that up is because Duel Masters is a lot like Disney Lorcana as far as the deck is set up. And what I mean is, in Duel Masters and Kaijudo, which was like an evolution of Duel Masters later on and kind of like came back, your deck is also your resource system. And what I mean, it's not like Pokemon, where Pokemon has separate cards, which are your energy cards, or like Magic the Gathering, which has your mana cards, which are your like your separate energy cards. In Disney Lorcana, almost every card in your hand can be used as what's called ink for your inkwell, which is essentially your resource. Now there are some cards that can't be used for ink, but that's something I'm going to go over. But because I have played Duel Masters and I do know what it's like to have a deck of cards that are also your resources, I do know what you should look for when you are making your deck. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive in. Again, these are just some helpful tips and tricks that I had used over the years when I was making these types of decks, and I do believe that they transfer over to Lorcana. So the first thing I would like to talk about would be how many copies of a card should you include in your deck? Because you can use cards as resources, it is probably a very good idea not to have single copies of cards in your deck, right? So you can have 60 card decks, and if you include like one copy of something, that's not ideal. You might not see it, first of all, because right now we don't have any search capabilities. That card could be on the bottom of your deck. Second of all, it is possible that you might accidentally put that card into your inkwell, because we do have cards that can add other cards to your inkwells to help you generate resources, but it's kind of random. It'll take the top card of your deck and put it into your resource system. What happens if that top card of your deck happens to be that single card? You know, maybe you have one copy of Dragon Form Maleficent, right? It's like your big Ruby drop, and maybe you're playing Ruby Sapphire and you happen to play one jump ahead, and lo and behold, the card on top of your deck happens to be that Maleficent. So, you know, completely wasted in a sense. Yeah, sure, you get an extra resource, but your Maleficent is gone. Now, with that being said, if you wanted to, you know, run a single copy of a card, you're going to want to run a second one. So let me just break this down, like as far as copies, like what does that mean? What do copies of a card in your deck mean? So for one, I have it broken down to 4 copies, 3 copies, and then 2 copies. If you have 4 copies of a card in your deck, that is a card that you're going to want to see often. You're going to want to see it basically every single game, and you want to see as many copies of it as you can. It should be a card that's like vital to your strategy, or maybe you're playing like a more aggressive tempo-y type deck and you want to play, say, Captain Hook, the Forceful Duelist one, the 1-drop. You're going to want 4 copies of that Captain Hook in your deck, so you have a better chance of drawing it in your starting hand, and so you're able to get, you know, a good start with that. And then you want to be able to play maybe a couple copies because you're trying to be more aggressive, you know, like aggro. Or maybe you're looking for stuff like Flounder, the new Sapphire card Flounder, or the Amethyst card Pascal. You're really trying to get those low drops, right? You're going to want 4 copies of those cards so you can see them more often. Now, if you have some cards in your deck where you do want to see them, but you really only need to play them maybe a couple times, you know, for example, Scar, the Sapphire Scar, when he comes down, he'll -5 an opponent's character's strength. so your other characters can trade into them. Now, is that something you need 4 copies of? Is that something you're going to be doing often? Me personally, I don't think so. I don't think that that scar should be used in that regard. Plus, it's also a 6 cost, so that's a little higher on your inkwell. You know, your mana system, essentially your resources. So that might be something you only play 3 copies of. You know, even if you say put one into your ink because it can be used for ink, that gives you 2 copies somewhere in your deck, or maybe you're also holding a second one, but 2 other copies in your deck where you're able to use that effect. And if you're able to put that card down and use that effect, fantastic. You know, you have the copies somewhere for you to be able to do that. Now, if you only have 2 copies of a card, the reason why you would include 2 copies of a card is because that's going to be a card where you are okay with either not playing it during a game or only playing it one time. Again, something like Dragon or Monstrous Dragon Maleficent, the Ruby one, that is 9 ink. That's a lot of ink. Yes, it has a fantastic ability when it's played, but it's kind of difficult to get to 9 ink. We do have some ramp, you know, but you're going to have to right now play blue. So you're going to have like a Ruby Sapphire deck, which isn't terrible. Get all that ramp, get to those 9 resources, and then be able to play that Maleficent. But as you're ramping, you might accidentally target one of your Maleficents, and that might end up in your inkwell. Now you can't use it. And this is going to be same for cards like Mickey Mouse. You know, the Mickey Mouse Brave Little Tailor, the 8 cost. You might not need, you know, 8 copies of that card because it costs 8 resources. You also have cards like Simba. Simba is a 7 cost card. Gontu is an 8 cost card. Those are going to be good examples of cards you might only want a couple versions of. Now, if your deck is maybe like the strategy of your deck is geared towards ramping towards higher cost, you know, not minions, but higher cost characters, then yeah, you can probably run a few more copies of cards like that. You could probably go up to maybe 3, but traditionally speaking, in a like a normal, you know, like mid-range deck or even a tempo deck, if you have a card you only want to see every so often, 2 copies of that is good. Like once a game, 2 copies. If there's a card you're okay with playing once or twice a game, 3 copies. Then if you have a card where you want to play as many copies of it as you can, you know, 2 to 3, maybe even 4 copies, then you're going to want 4 copies of that card in your deck. So that's something to keep in mind. You know, so when you're deck building, be like, okay, what cards are super important to me, and find those cards and then put 4 copies of those, and then just kind of make the other ones, you know, if they're not as vital, put 3 copies. If it's a card that, you know, might show up every so often you're cool with, put 2 copies. I would highly recommend not putting a single copy of a card in your deck unless, say, we do have some way to search your deck, and or B, you don't have any cards that say, you know, add additional resources to your inkwell randomly. If you do have a way to say, take a card from your hand and put it into your inkwell, like an additional one, okay, that's a little different. But I'm assuming that most of this is going to be fairly random, like top card, or maybe, actually, yeah, probably just top card of your deck. So, again, so my tip here is, I wouldn't run just 1 copy of a card in your deck. Run at least 2 copies of any card in your deck. So we'll go ahead and move on then. And I had brought this up before when I was talking about the cards, but some cards have swirls and some don't. And when I say that, I mean like up in the cost of the card. Captain Hook, for example. Captain Hook Forceful Duelist, the 1 cost steel card. That Captain Hook has a swirl up in the corner where his cost is. That swirl means that he can be used as ink, or he can be used as a resource. You're able to put him down, face down, into your resource pool, and then you can use that resource to play your other cards. Now, some cards don't have that swirl. Cards like Dragonfire from Ruby, the other Captain Hook card from Steel, that one also doesn't have swirl. And then just as another example, the Mickey Mouse Detective, the Sapphire Mickey Mouse, he also does not have the swirl. So those 3 cards cannot be used as ink. You are unable to take them from your hand and put them down into your inkwell. However, these cards can still be used for ink if they are taken from the top of your deck by effects like Mickey Mouse Detective or the Sapphire card One Jump Ahead, which also takes the card from the top card from your deck and puts it down into your inkwell. Now, when you're building your deck, it is important to have more cards that have swirls than cards that don't have swirls. Now, if you are playing a deck where what the curve is lower, and what I mean by curve is if you look at all the cards you want to play, and maybe the highest cost card is like 4 resources, right? This is a very quick, fast deck. If it's something like that, you can get away with playing non-swirl cards, like more non-swirl cards, I suppose, maybe even a 50-50 split or so, because you're not going to need that many resources in your inkwell in order to play all your cards. So that might be something to keep in mind, but traditionally speaking, you're probably going to want to get up to 6, maybe 7 resources or so, something like that. There are some really good 7 drops we've seen, but again, it just depends on your deck. There are also some really good 6 and 5 cost cards, and if you would like, you can just get up to that point and and then play those cards. What I would recommend as right now is probably some sort of like 2-to-1 splits of swirl cards versus non-swirls. So if you're running a 60 card deck, probably running 40 cards that have swirls and about 20 cards that don't have swirls, that's going to be a fairly decent ratio, and that's going to be something that you can like build off of. With that type of ratio, like if you get your starting hand of 7, you're going to get around like 4 to 5 cards that have swirls, and maybe like 2 to 3 that don't, something like that. Ideally speaking, you're going to have more that do have swirls, and that's going to be good. That means you're going to be able to play cards from your hand, on your first couple turns. Now, there are cards that do generate extra resources for you that don't have swirls. Again, the Mickey Mouse Detective in Sapphire, and also the Sapphire card One Jump Ahead, they don't have swirls. You can't use them for your inkwell. However, by playing them, you can add resources to your inkwell. So that's something to keep in mind as well. There are times, and I might mention this a little later too as like a little tip, you don't have to play your ink from your hand. If you have, you get to turn 3 and you know that your deck kind of tops out at say like around 5 or 6 resources, so you don't really need that, you don't really need to go that fast. Maybe you're holding cards in your hand that don't have like 5 or 6 resources yet to cast, I suppose. You could just play on your 3rd turn, play say Mickey Mouse Detective, get that top card off of your deck into your resource pool, and now you're going to have like your 4 resources, which is the same as you having played one from your hand. Yes, you're not ahead. You're not, say, also playing one from your hand, so you'd be up to 5 resources on your next turn. But if your opponent is not ramping, which is adding, extra cards to their resource as well, you're going to be on even footing with them. Heck, you could even be, one step ahead. Maybe they could not be playing cards or something, but most people are going to be playing cards into their inkwell. But it's just a point. It's like, don't feel bad. Don't feel like you have to put something down every turn, especially when there are cards that will help you generate resources. So if you do have a goal of getting to a higher costed card quickly, then yes, absolutely play cards from your hand, the swirl cards, put those down, and then play cards like the Mickey Mouse, like the One Jump Ahead, that will help you generate more resources to play those bigger characters. However, if that is not something, like a strategy of yours, don't be afraid to not play resources, especially when you're still able to generate one, because now you're going to be holding cards in your hand that you can play onto the field instead of placing them into your inkwell. You're still going to be generating those resources, but like with Mickey Mouse, not only does Mickey Mouse generate a resource, but you're putting a character onto the field. He's still able to go questing for you. He's still able to go challenging for you, and he also generated a resource for you. So those are all fantastic things. What I've learned from Duel Masters is you don't have to always play a resource, especially when you get to a certain point, and also like later in the game. You know, once everyone's like sitting at like 6 or 7 resources, I mean, at that point, you don't need to play anymore, unless again you have some higher costed characters in your deck and you need to get to those resources. So just to recap real quick, for like swirls versus say non-swirl cards, I would recommend having about 40 cards in your deck that have swirls and maybe about 20 that don't. And this number can be changed again depending on what your deck needs, or like how fast you want your deck to go, I suppose. If you have a lot of low cost cards, you probably don't need as many swirl cards as you would non-swirls. But I bet if you're playing more high cost stuff, you're going to want to have more swirl cards, so you are able to get those resources into play in order to play those higher costed cards. So another tip I would like to strongly recommend is adding removal cards to your deck. This is just something, it's like a tip, like when you're deck building and you're adding cards, find out like, you know, what your color is, what colors are you playing, and then find either characters or action cards or maybe items, we don't know. Add those cards to your deck that are able to deal with your opponent's characters. So for example, the Ruby card Dragonfire, that is a type of removal card. It just banishes one of your opponent's characters. We also have the Sapphire card Let It Go, the song card. That will also take one of your opponent's characters. It does sort of banish them, but you're putting it face down into their resource area, so it is removed from play. By the time you have 5 resources, adding an extra one to your opponent's inkwell isn't really going to be a big deal. I wouldn't feel bad about doing that. So depending on what colors you're playing, though, you're going to want to, you know, fiddle, I guess, with your numbers. Now, if you're playing something right now, say Ruby and Emerald, we don't really have any direct removal for Emerald. We don't have any action cards that will banish or deal damage. So you're going to want to run, say, 4 copies of Dragonfire in your Ruby Emerald deck. And sure, you're probably going to be running like the Cat and Cruella, which is great. Those are characters that are going to do their thing. But you need like direct removal to deal with your opponent's threats, because there are some very scary characters now. We have like Simba, the new Aladdin, you know, even Maleficent, Moana. Those characters are very scary, and they help your opponent like win the game. We need to be able to deal with those, and that's where removal comes in. So again, in my Ruby Emerald, you know, suggestion, you're going to be running 4 copies of Dragonfire right now, because we really don't have anything to run for Emerald. Now, what if you're playing Ruby Sapphire? Both of those colors have a removal spell that costs 5 resources. At this point, it is up to you. Now, Dragonfire cannot be used for ink, whereas Let It Go not only can be used for ink, but because it's a song card, you are able to exert one of your characters to remove one of your opponent's characters essentially from play, just to make them have some ink. So it's one of those, do you run 4 copies of each? Or should you only run 4 copies of one and maybe like 2 to 3 of the other? Or run 3 copies of one and 3 copies of the other? It's totally up to you. You're definitely going to want to have at least 4 copies of a removal spell right now, you know, to deal with opponent's boards. You can, you know, rely on challenging with your characters if you have a deck that's like really geared towards that, but just generally speaking, in the future, once we have more cards, definitely add some sort of removal spell, at least 4 copies of some direct removal spell to your deck, no matter the color you have, because that'll help you deal with any scary characters that your opponent has on their board. It can also help with stuff like Aurora, Dreaming Guardian, where she gives all of your opponent's characters ward, but not herself. You could target that Aurora and then take that Aurora out, and then be able to deal with your other, you know, opponent's characters by directly targeting them with spells or abilities or whatnot. So just from this section, run removal. Whatever you can get, run some sort of removal in your deck. Another thing I'd like to talk about is actually the deck size. So per the rules, it's not a hard 60 cards. It is a 60 card minimum deck. And what does that mean? So that means you can have more than 60 cards in your deck if that's what you wish. I would not recommend having more than 60 cards. The reason why is that you're going to want to have a consistent deck. You're going to build a strategy for something. Like, for example, I really like the Mickey Mouse card, the Amethyst one, where he has really good synergy with brooms. I think that's fun and it's very silly, and I'm really hoping for a couple more broom cards. Now, with that being said, I'm going to want to run, brooms in my deck, and I'm going to want to try to get Mickey out as soon as I can and get as many brooms as I can into play and do some silly broom stuff. If I have more than 60 cards in my deck, I might not be able to find the cards I'm looking for. I might not be able to find my brooms, or I might not even be able to find a Mickey. The closer I am to 60, the more consistent and concise my deck will be. I know what I'm going to want to do nearly every game. I know what turns I want to play cards, and I know what resources I'm going to put into my resource pool, and all these various things. If I had more than 60 cards, that's more cards that kind of muddle it. Just muddles the mix, and you don't know what you're going to get. Essentially, like, almost every game is going to be different, and you might not hit those key cards that help with your strategy. You can go above 60. That is something you could do, if that's really what you want. But again, I wouldn't recommend it. I would really recommend staying as close to 60 as possible. And the best way to do this is, when you make your deck, go ahead and make your deck, find all the cards you want to add into your deck, and then put 4 copies of all those cards into your deck. Now, if you have more than 15 different cards, you're going to have more than 60 cards. At that point, what you could do is, instead of just cutting a whole character or an action card or something from the deck, just reduce its numbers. Look at all your cards and think, is this character something I want to see every game? If yes, keep it at 4. If it's maybe, keep it at a 3. Or if it's I like this card a lot, but he does cost 8 resources, so that might be hard, that's a 2 cost card. And go through your deck and do that process for every single card. You might find that some cards overlap. Maybe you're playing too many 1-drop cards and maybe not enough cards that are 4 or 5. It's good to lay all your cards out by their resource value, so you can kind of see like where your curve is. You can see where the bulk of your cards lie, and then if you have too many cards on, say on the higher end, you might want to take some of those 5 or 6 cost cards out and maybe look into some of the more 2, 3, 4 cost cards, so that you're able to do more things at the beginning of the turn. Because it's not going to be fun if your hand has 4, 5, 6 cost characters and your opponent, is sitting here putting out character after character, turn after turn, where your turns are, I'm going to put this Maleficent into my inkwell and I pass. And then I'm going to put this Maurice into my inkwell and then I'm going to pass. That's not fun. That's not going to be fun for you. Make sure, your curve is there. You have some good low cost cards, you have some good high cost cards. But keep it to close to 60 cards, because again, consistency. We want to make sure that our deck is doing the same thing basically every single game, and also with less cards, because we don't have a ton of draw right now. But if we have no way to search, when you have 60 cards, you're able to get through your deck a little quicker, especially when we do have cards that do allow us to draw like more than, say, a single card on a turn, especially in other colors. So I would just recommend staying as close to 60 cards as possible. And then the last thing, I touched on this earlier, so I just want to kind of bring it up, is when it's like kind of like a tip, I suppose, and it's something to think about maybe in the back of your mind when you're deck building, is you don't always have to play an ink into your inkwell. I wouldn't worry about it. Now, during your first couple turns, I would say probably about your 3, maybe turn 4, definitely, be putting ink down into your inkwell so you're able to play some cards. Now, obviously, this would be different if you have cards in your deck that can help ramp you versus not ramp you. But if you know what your deck does, you know what you're trying to do, then it's something. Then adding, extra cards to your inkwell is just essentially throwing cards away from your hand where you could otherwise play. You might get to turn 4 and you have, 3 or 4 cards in your hand, and maybe those cards cost like 3 or 4 or less. And it's like, why pitch them? Why should I pitch these cards when, I can instead play them? But again, it depends on your deck. If you have to get to a certain point, like maybe I need to at least have 5 resources so I can play Moana, or I can play Mulan, or I have a really item heavy Sapphire deck, I need to try to get the 6 resources so I can play Maurice, so I can really get my item engine going. And that's fine. You know what your deck does there. But you don't want to fall behind either. If your opponent is putting out a lot of value and they're playing a lot of low cost creatures, it might be good to hold on to those cards in your hand. So maybe on your turn with your 4 resources, instead of playing, say, a purple Mickey Mouse into your inkwell, you play that one instead. You're like, okay, I'm going to put him down because your hand maybe has other cards that are going to help you deal with what your opponent's doing. And also, your opponent could be just dropping ink every turn as well. If they have no draw, they're going to be running out of cards because you are you're losing 1 card every turn if you're not drawing a card, by playing a card and then by putting something into your inkwell, right? So like I could start the game with 7 cards in my hand. I don't draw a card. I take one of the one of my cards in my hand, I put it down. So now I only have 6 cards. And then I'm going to use that ink. I'm going to play a 1-drop, say, Flounder. Now I only have 5 cards. I only have 5 cards in my starting hand. So on my next turn, I will draw a card. I go up to 6. I play another card in my inkwell. I go down to 5. And then if I play another character, I'm going to go down to 4 cards. And this is just going to add up after a couple turns. I'm not going to have anything. So it just might be good, if you just play a character, you draw a card and play a character at a point, you're going to be like positive. No, not positive. I'm sorry. You're not going to be negative. You're just going to be like net 0. And if you're able to draw some extra cards, then you're going to be a little more positive. So it all depends on what your hand is, though. If you do have a hand of, say, items and you're holding a Maurice or a couple Maurices, and you really want to get him into play, yeah, getting that ramp, getting those cards in play for the ink, that's obviously beneficial. But if your hand is full of low cost cards, it might be better just to play them. Establish that board control. That way your opponent's going to think twice about questing because you're going to be doing the challenging in return. Or if your opponent doesn't have any characters, you can freely quest and get that early lore. So it's just a tip I have. As you play more, you'll know what your deck can or cannot do. You don't want to run out of steam. You definitely don't want to be in like top decking mode where you have no cards in your hand and you're just drawing a card and you can't put into your ink. Like if you do, then you're doing nothing and you're just hoping to draw something. So after, say, 3 or 4 turns of putting cards into your ink, slow down a little bit, assess the situation, and don't feel like you just have to keep putting your hand into your inkwell. You gotta play the game too. So it's better to play the cards that in your hand than to just throw them away to the inkwell. So that's just a tip I have there. Oh, and that's especially true if you have ramp. So if you're able to play like Detective Mickey or One Jump Ahead, putting cards into your inkwell is maybe not the best idea because you're already going to be generating resources. So get that board control. Get to a certain point, you get that board control and hold on to your cards, right? Now, once we get more draw, once we have more cards and more colors that let us draw more cards, that's going to be a little different. Like right now we have Steel, which has Tinkerbell and Beast Mirror, which do allow you to draw a card. Tinkerbell kind of does, but Beast Mirror does only if you have no cards in hand. And then we also have Magic Mirror and Amethyst. That lets you draw a card for 4 resources. Not terrible. And of course, Maurice lets you draw a card whenever you play an item. So we got some stuff there. There's some, but I'm still really hoping for like an action card, like you play it and you just draw. It's like 4 resources, draw 2 cards or something. That would be great. That would be great, but we'll see. Anyway, those are just some of my tips and tricks I have, for deck building. And these mostly come from, say, my Duel Master background, because again, the Duel Master cards, it's like the same principle. The cards we also use as the resource. So if anything, run more copies of cards in your deck. Do not run a single copy of a card. I mean, if you only have one and you can't get any more and you want to risk it, go ahead. I'm not going to stop you. These are just my helpful ideas and whatnot. But yeah, no, definitely run more copies. Try to stay as close to 60 cards as possible. Please add removal. Definitely add removal to your deck. And then once more colors have it, definitely add some draw. You're going to want to draw cards. I know I'm maybe mentioning it a little too late. Draw is actually a really, really big deal in this game, because when you're using your hand for your resources, you're going to want to have cards in your hand to play. So drawing cards is just going to be really, really good. Make sure you draw cards. Make sure you add those draw cards. Make sure you add your removal. Stay as close to 60 cards as possible, and run several copies of your cards, right? 2, 3, 2 plus, but I would say probably 3 to 4 to be safe. You can even just run just a few, run your favorites, play 4 copies. If you're tired of seeing a card too much, take out a copy or 2, add some other ones, play around the numbers, but that's my idea. Run at least 2 cards in a deck. So yeah, those are just all my tips and stuff. Oh, and of course, be careful with swirls versus non-swirls. Don't run too many non-swirl cards, or you're gonna have a bad time. You're not gonna be able to play them for resources, and then what are you gonna do? But I think the balance isn't too bad. But all right, those are again just some of my tips and tricks. Some deck building tips and tricks, I suppose, that I have for the game. Take what you want. If you have any other tips and tricks, you can leave them in the comments and be like, actually, I found this is a really good idea. I'll be like, oh, let me write that down when I actually get some physical copies of cards and whatnot. If you're making your deck for the first time and you're like, oh gosh, I don't know what to do. Well, here you go. Here's some tips and tricks, to add to your deck and whatnot. I mean, we don't have a ton of cards right now, so the options are a little limited, but it's still good to keep in mind in the future. So, but hey, thanks for watching. My normal mic broke. I hope this doesn't sound too bad. I don't know why. It just died. It worked yesterday, and then it just died today. So I don't know. It is what it is. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Stay safe out there. Make good decisions, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, bye.